up, you guys? Welcome to another video of Halloween, and this one is about two killers known as the Toolbox Killers. I'd never even heard of them before I just stumbled across them randomly and knew this is something so important to speak about. So many people feel it's such a taboo thing to speak about murder and serial killers and all these things, but understanding someone's mindset behind it can help prevent other issues from other people. It can help you look out for those around you and really pick up on behavior. And the behavior from these men is absolutely terrifying and will make your skin crawl. And it's so messed up what is still happening to this day. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So on June 24th, 1979, a string of brutal murders began, indicating that a set of killers was out on the loose in Southern California. The killers were known to sexually assault, torture, and then kill their victims using common items that could be bought at a hardware store, which is how they were coined the Toolbox Killers. Their names were Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker and Roy Lewis Norris. Lawrence was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on September 27th, 1940, and his life was far from the best. His parents didn't want children. They had never wanted children, so he was immediately put into an orphanage right after he was born and was later adopted into the Bittaker family. He moved a lot during his childhood because of his father's job, and it created a lot of chaos in his life, and what you live, you usually reflect, so he decided to start creating his own chaos at a very, very early age. By the age of 12, he was arrested for the first time for shoplifting, and this continued over the next couple of years. He seemed so preoccupied with theft and living this sort of lifestyle that he ended up dropping out of high school in 1957, and within a year, he had managed to pick up 3 more charges, including car theft, evading arrest, and a hit and run. So he just was so wrapped up in this criminal lifestyle. This ended up landing him in the California Youth Authority until he was 18 when he was released. And upon being released, things kind of just got worse for him because his family had abandoned him. They didn't want anything to do with him. They did not approve of his lifestyle, obviously. Not only had they kind of disowned him, they'd actually entirely left the state and not said anything to him. So this infuriated him and ended up leading to more devastating behavior. Roy himself had a similar-ish upbringing. He was born in Greenlee, Colorado on February 5th, 1948, but he had been conceived out of marriage, and his parents ended up quickly getting married to avoid accusations of an illegitimate birth. But this was really kind of the least of their worries, being accused of illegitimate birth. Roy's father started to work at a scrapyard, which made bare minimum for the family, and the mother stayed at home and was strung out on drugs. They did not really want to be together. They did not want to have this child. It was an issue. Roy spent more time bouncing around from foster care to foster care family than he did with his own family. When he was with his own family, he was constantly belittled. He was told he was not good enough, that they didn't want him. And then when he was with foster families, they often denied him food. They often denied him clothes. One family in particular apparently sexually assaulted him, according to him, and this spiraled his life out of control. He was at a young female relative's house at one point, and he started to speak to her in an unwanted sexual manner, very aggressively, and this young woman ended up telling his father, who kicked him out and basically threatened him. So this was his first real run-in, I guess, with deviant sexual behavior. His response to this was stealing his father's car, and then he drove to the mountains and unsuccessfully attempted to end his life. Now, he ended up being found. As I said, it was an unsuccessful attempt, and no one really questioned what was going on in his life, why he would act out like this, so they just sent him back to his father, which was not a good situation. They basically took him back in and said, "You've made our life terrible. We don't even want to be married anymore. Your sister's also unwanted," because they did go on to have a second child, and he was basically informed that the second he was of age, he was being disowned and his parents are going to divorce. So this obviously messed him up, and he dropped out of school and decided to join the Navy to get away from his family. He was deployed to Vietnam for a short period of time, and while in the Navy, the bad behavior continued. He attempted to sexually assault one woman by forcing his way into her car. He deceivingly convinced another woman to allow him into her home to try to sexually assault her. And after these instances, the Navy discharged him, claiming that he had severe schizoid personality disorder. Now, I had to look this up. Keep in mind, I am not a medical professional. I am just gathering the information that I find online. Everyone's experience with any sort of mental health disorder is different, but from what I have seen, this is not the same thing as schizophrenia. It's a personality disorder, but it's characterized by basically a lack of interest in social relationships. People that struggle with this typically tend to be loners. They are very dismissive. They don't speak to people. They don't hang out in friend groups. They usually don't show pretty much any emotion. They appear to genuinely just not care about all things at all times. Very apathetic, basically. So Roy continued to attack females after this when he returned to San Diego and Redondo Beach. I believe he was living with his mother at the time, and he was arrested a few times for these instances, and it ended him in the California men's colony, and this is where he met Lawrence. So we've got two different males, both with a lot of criminal struggles. Lawrence was more along the lines of theft and things like that, while Roy was known for sexually aggressive behavior. So as I said, they met in the California men's colony. Now, Roy seemed to associate with the hard criminals, and he also dealt with a lot of the drugs in the facility. So Lawrence basically saw him as someone worth trying to create a friendship with, or at least, becoming an acquaintance. And then a couple of times, Lawrence actually ended up saving Roy from different attacks on multiple different occasions, and this really sealed the deal on their friendship. And once they became closer, they realized they had something else in common. They both had an interest in sexual violence. Lovely. This started constant meetings between Roy and Lawrence, and this is where the idea of the Toolbox Killings essentially started to be planned. They would meet with each other, discuss these plans they had, and they decided they were going to assault and kill teenage girls the second they were released from prison, basically. The second they both became free, they would meet each other and start their killings, and they planned to kill one young woman from the age of 13 to 19 out of each year. Lawrence was the first to be released in October of 1978, and he ended up getting a job as a mechanic while he was waiting for Roy. He was staying in a motel, and he was becoming good friends with all of the local teenagers. He would often have them in his motel room. He kept it stocked with beer and marijuana, so it became just a really popular spot. I don't know if this was him trying to do research on the best way to, communicate with people this age or what, but 3 months later, Roy ended up being released in January of 1979, and he moved in with his mom in Redondo Beach before getting a job as an electrician, and it only took until February for Lawrence to write him, planning to meet him in a hotel so they could act on their plan. Now, they met at this hotel, and they decided the final aspects of their plan. They thought the best way to go about this was to get a different, larger vehicle. They wanted to contain the crime scene to one place. So they settled on a 1977 GMC cargo van. So a big white van with no windows in the back and a sliding door. They figured this would allow easy access to jump out and get back in with the people that they took. And it's terrifying because they named this van Murder Mac. But they still wanted to perfect their plan a little bit further. So from that month in February of 79 all the way to June, they used their van and the tactics that they had come up with to pick up over 20 women in need of rides. Now, none of these women were actually harmed, or at least that's what we know. But they basically called these their practice runs, and they tried different ideas, different ways to coerce women into the vans with them, different ways to gain trust, different locations, different routes that they took. And while they did this, they finished out the construction on Murder Mac. They put a bed in the back of the van, fully stocked it with tools underneath this bed that no one could see. They kept a cooler full of beer and soda, which again was kind of one of their tactics of encouraging these young women to come in. And then the crimes began. So on June 24th, 1979, they went down to Redondo Beach. A 16-year-old named Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was leaving a Presbyterian church in Redondo Beach, and they saw her walking on the street at around 7:46 p.m. that night, and they decided this was it. This was going to be their first victim. So they tried a few times to lure her into the van, but it was not going as planned. She did not want to get into it. They kept trying to offer her beer, marijuana, all these different things, a ride home. She just said no. So they decided to try something different. They drove ahead of her, pulled over on the side of the road, and opened up the sliding door and just kind of stood there waiting for her to pass. When Lucinda walked by, they exchanged a few words, and then Roy dragged her into the van. They turned the radio up as high as they could, which is something that they did every single time from this point on to try to hide the screams or sounds of their victims. And they bound her legs and arms with duct tape, and they gagged her. Now, when they had been doing their practice runs, they found a fire road in San Gabriel Mountains that obviously was not used very often. So they broke the lock off of this fire road, changed it with their own lock, only they had a key for, and this is where they were going to take their victims. They took Lucinda down this road, and they both sexually assaulted her. They had back and forth banter right in front of her, discussing whether or not they should kill her. Roy finally decided to manually strangle Lucinda, but only after 45 seconds he freaked out and ran out of the van throwing up because he said he was so disturbed by the look in her eyes. So Lawrence finished off the job with manual strangulation and with a wire coat hanger. They then took her body, wrapped her up, and threw her over a canyon where Lawrence claimed that the animals would eat her, leaving no evidence behind. While that victim was successful, there were a handful of victims in all of this that managed to escape their attempted abduction, and even one woman that reported on September 30th that year that she had been sprayed with mace, thrown into a van by two white males, sexually assaulted, and then released. But there still were more victims. After their successful first attack on Lucinda, the men were basically on a high. So 2 weeks later, they decided to go on the hunt again. On July 8th, 1979, 18-year-old Andrea Joy Hall was walking on the Pacific Coast Highway looking for a ride. They attempted to pull over, seeing her as a prime target, but another car beat them to it, and she got in and drove off with them. But they knew she's hitchhiking, she's going to be dropped off somewhere, so they decided to follow this car, and sure enough, she was dropped off in an area in Redondo Beach, and the men sprung into action. Roy hid in the back of the van while Lawrence did all the sweet talking to Andrea, and they hoped this made it appear less threatening since she would only believe there was one man there and not two. Lawrence offered her a soda, which she accepted, and when she walked to the back of the van to get this soda, Roy ended up attacking her, pulled her into the van, bound her arms and legs, and gagged her, and she was again, just like Lucinda, driven to the fire road. She was sexually assaulted multiple times, but then another small wrench was thrown into their action with this. Another vehicle was thought to have been seen passing by, possibly trying to get up the fire road, so they panicked, drove to a second location where they continued to sexually assault Andrea, and then they forced her to pose for Polaroids. They then drove her back to another location where Lawrence was actually alone with Andrea for a while. He asked Roy to go out, grab them some drinks at a local gas station, and when Roy returned, Andrea was dead. Lawrence explained that he told Andrea to list him as many reasons as she could as to why she should be kept alive, but before he allowed her to say anything, he killed her with an ice pick before throwing her body off of a cliff. It took about a month before the next attack. I'm sure the extended timing likely had something to do with the fact that Roy was not a part of that second kill, but still the third and fourth attack came at the same exact time. On September 3rd, Roy and Lawrence were at Hermosa Beach when they noticed two very, very young women sitting at a bus stop. 15-year-old Jackie Gilliam and 13-year-old Jacqueline Leah Lamp. 15 and 13 years old. 13 years old, you guys. Roy and Lawrence offered them marijuana and they immediately hopped into the van, no questions asked. They were so dang young. The girls noticed that the van had clearly gotten off the highway at some point, and this is when they sort of started to panic and ask questions, and Jacqueline ended up trying to open the sliding door to jump out, but was quickly hit over the head with a bag that was filled with weights for situations like this and knocked unconscious. Roy was in the back with them and Lawrence was driving, and Roy decided to grab Jackie and bound her arms and her legs. At this point, this hadn't been done yet. He then proceeded to try to gag her, but at some point, Jacqueline managed to come back to and again managed to actually successfully open the sliding door and jump out of the van. Roy chased after her and was trying to bring her back, but this was obviously creating a huge scene and there were people around, so someone could have witnessed this. So Lawrence took things into his own hands. He went to the back of the van and punched Jackie directly in the face, knocking her out, and then further restrained Jacqueline, made sure they both were tied up so something like this couldn't happen again. Both girls were held hostage for 2 days in the San Gabriel Mountains. This is something that Roy and Lawrence had not done yet. Typically, they only kept the girls for a short period of time before killing them. I think likely because they acted out, the men wanted to feel more control over them and torture them more, which is exactly what they did. These two young girls endured endless sexual and physical assaults from Roy and Lawrence, things that I am nowhere near even comfortable saying in this video. It was disturbing and difficult enough to read about. They each had the pictures taken of them on the Polaroid, just like the other two victims had. Jacqueline ended up being killed using an ice pick and being strangled, and if I'm not mistaken, one man did one while the other did the other to her. Jackie was killed with a sledgehammer blow to the head and strangulation as well. All women always strangled with a wire coat hanger. And they were thrown over an embankment as well. And this leads us to our final victim, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. On October 31st, 1979, she was abducted by the two men outside of a gas station attempting to get a ride home from a Halloween party. The reason she got into this van was because she recognized Lawrence. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant. I've seen claims that Lawrence had tried to ask her out multiple times and she denied him, so this was a personal thing. It created trust, so that's why she got into the vehicle. She believed she was in safe hands, but for Lawrence, he wanted revenge pretty much. They did not go to the fire road at this point. They drove to a secluded location where they bound and gagged Shirley, and Lawrence stayed in the back of the van alone with her and told Roy to drive around aimlessly until he was done, which Roy did for about an hour. This entire time, Roy was recording everything that was happening in the back of the van. I don't know if he recorded every assault they did, but he definitely recorded this one. He proceeded to beat and mock Shirley. He sexually assaulted her multiple times, tortured her, did things to her body that are just unimaginable and vicious and disgusting. And then when he felt he was done with her, he decided to switch places and give Roy a turn while he drove around. Roy basically just kept continuing what Lawrence had been doing to Shirley. He grabbed a sledgehammer and broke her elbow with it, and then repeatedly hit that same broken elbow, I think 20-something times in a row afterwards. And then within the next 2 hours, after continuously enduring this physical and sexual and emotional abuse by these men, she was strangled with a wire coat hanger. But Lawrence wasn't done with her. Lawrence didn't feel like he humiliated her as much as she had humiliated him. Everybody at this point had been tossed over a cliff. Lawrence felt like no one saw their work, and that's literally what they viewed this as. They thought that no one was seeing it, no one was appreciating it. So they drove to a random house in Sunland and they threw Shirley's naked body into the middle of someone's front yard to be discovered, which it was the following morning by a jogger, and it caused mass hysteria. Her body was taken in for an autopsy, and at this point, this was the only body that they had. Authorities were completely unaware of the other victims. They knew these young women were missing, but they did not have any idea any of this was really connected. So this was their first look into the crimes that Roy and Lawrence had committed, and I refuse again to get into details of what was done to this woman. It was traumatizing for me to read. The things that she had to endure, like, immediately make me want to throw up physically and cry. It's devastating how her body was treated by them, like absolutely devastating what these men do. They tortured her so badly. And I cannot understand how a human being could do that to another human being. But this ended up leading to their capture. Lawrence kind of seemed to be progressively doing crazier and crazier things and getting riskier and riskier, and Roy felt the need to confide in someone close about what they had been doing. So he ended up meeting with a man named Joseph Jackson that was incarcerated with him while he was in the men's colony, so the same place that Lawrence was. I don't know if this man knew Lawrence, but Roy told Joseph in great detail what they had done. He told him the names of the victims. He told them all about the different ways that they tortured the young women. He told them about where they disposed of the bodies. He told them about all of their attempts that were unsuccessful. He told Joseph everything, and Joseph immediately took this information and went to his lawyer to ask what to do, because I'm sure he was scared, being a criminal himself, that he could potentially be linked to this. So he ended up being told, best advice, go to LAPD and tell them what you know, which is exactly what he did. And it didn't take long for the detective that was put on the case, Paul Bynum, to realize that Joseph was telling the truth. It's a really slippery slope to be on when an ex-convict comes and tells you insider information that another criminal has said. Oftentimes it's things that are made up, falsified, all of that, just so they can get some sort of benefit for themselves. So that's always an issue, and officers have to kind of take these things very slowly with a grain of salt, but Paul Bynum was connecting all the dots. Joseph knew about every single disappearance. He knew the dates that these women disappeared. He knew locations and other details that authorities had already kind of collected that matched perfectly. He, again, knew the names of all the women that had escaped, some of which had called into authorities and no one would have known about unless they were a part of the crime or had been told by the person who did it. Authorities knew that their best bet at solidifying all of this information was to get someone in agreement that Lawrence and Roy were the ones responsible for all of this madness. So they went to a woman named Robin Robeck, and this is the young woman that was pulled into the van, sexually assaulted, and then let go. And she had reported it. So they went to her house, they showed her multiple different pictures, laid them all out, and she immediately was able to identify Lawrence and Roy as the two white males that had attacked her that day. They immediately put Roy under surveillance because Roy was the one that went to talk to Joseph. He just mentioned Lawrence's name. They didn't really have anything directly connecting him to this, and they ended up being able to arrest Roy on November 20th, 1979. It was not for the murders. It was not for the abductions, not for the sexual assaults. They couldn't get him on that yet because they had no evidence, but they did witness him deal marijuana, and this violated his current parole. Shortly after this, they were able to arrest Lawrence as well. Again, he was in possession of drugs that violated his parole, and they also arrested him for Robin's assault. Now, I'm not quite sure why they arrested Lawrence for it and not Roy, but either way, that's how they brought these men in. But then things started to fall apart. They really were relying a lot on Robin Robeck, the only victim they knew of that survived and was actually assaulted. And they brought her in for a lineup. They needed to, in person, confirm that these two men were responsible, but she could not identify them when they were in a lineup. So this kind of caused a lot of issues, and they knew they'd have to find other evidence to connect these men to the crimes. They started searches where the men lived and in other locations, and they were able to find Polaroids in Lawrence's home of Andrea Hall and Jackie Gilliam, 2 women that Roy said were involved in this, that they had murdered, and 2 women that were known as missing at the time. Then in Roy's motel, they ended up finding several bottles of different kinds of acid, and they believed it was very possible this was going to be used to maybe even further the hope that the women's bodies would never be found. They also found a woman's bracelet. They found in total pictures of about 500 teenage girls, 500 different individuals, not just 500 photos, 500 young women. Some of the pictures were of their victims. Other ones had been taken at a local high school without anyone knowing, like a peeping Tom sort of situation. After finding all of this in the men's homes, they then decided to search the van, and this kind of sealed the deal, obviously. This was the location of all of the crimes. They were able to find the sledgehammer. They were able to find a plastic bag filled with weights, which was used to knock out the women. They found Vaseline. They found 2 necklaces, and then they found the recording of the last murder. They were able to identify the 2 necklaces that they found as belonging to 2 of the young women that had gone missing. I couldn't find out which ones in specific. And the bracelet that Roy had with him was Shirley's. They had their men, and they had enough evidence. On November 30th, 1979, Roy had to attend a preliminary hearing for the sexual assault against Robin, and he seemed to be spiraling. He was not doing okay. He waived his Miranda rights completely. He denied being involved in anything in regards to Robin or any of the other accusations that were against him. But as soon as they started pulling out all of the evidence they had that he didn't know they had, he crashed and burned. He confessed to everything, but he also tried to convince everyone that Lawrence was the main ringleader in everything and that he was more responsible for the crimes than Roy was. He brought up the fact that Andrea Joy Hall had been killed while he wasn't even there. He really was trying to push everything on Lawrence. But he also saw this as an opportunity to get a deal and tell all of the information, which is actually where all of the stories come from, is straight from Roy's version of everything, which is interesting because we get that. However, it's also one person's perspective on things, a criminal, a crazy murderer at that. So how much we want to trust this, I'll kind of leave that up to you. He basically said that they had hatched this plan while in the men's colony together. He said all of the events about how they reunited after they were released, and he said that their main plan was to find women they both found attractive along the Pacific Coast Highway, and those were the people that they would attack. He said that majority of the women that they actually approached refused the rides, and they didn't want to have to physically drag all of the women in their car, so a lot of people that could have been victims managed to escape simply by saying no. And then the ones that accepted the help from these men or any of the offers that they gave them, those were the ones that ended up becoming their victims. He explained what they did to all of the women. Again, graphic. If you want to look it up, go for it. But I'm just saying, you're going to wish that you hadn't. And he explained where they took them. They attempted to track down other women from the Polaroids because, again, there were 500 women and Roy had only told them 5 victims. Plus, they knew of all of the possible incidents that didn't happen to work out. And they thought there was no way 5 victims was the total count when there were 500 Polaroids. So they ended up successfully finding 60 of the women in the Polaroids. None of them had been harmed in any way, shape, or form. I believe most of these were just pictures taken of women at the local high school. However, 19 of these 500 women were missing teenage girls. And somehow Roy and Lawrence, known murderers, had pictures of them. But unfortunately, they had no evidence to link Roy or Lawrence to any of these 19 young women other than these Polaroids, and nothing in the Polaroids indicated that these women were no longer alive or anything like that, so they couldn't really act on it. Roy then led authorities to San Gabriel Mountains, where he showed them where they had disposed of the bodies. They were successfully able to locate Jacqueline and Jackie on February 9th, 1980, but despite extensive searches and even help from Roy, they were not able to find Lucinda and Andrea, and we already know that Shirley had been left in the middle of someone's yard. so 2 of the young women's bodies have never been found. Then, by February of 1980, both men had been charged with all 5 murders of the young women. Lawrence was denied bail because he was not cooperative during all of this, but Roy had his bail set at $10,000 simply because he cooperated. Roy also ended up taking a plea deal so he could avoid the death penalty, and it required him to testify against Lawrence. And this is one reason I'm kind of iffy about the story Roy gives, because he was really catering to himself in all of this. Finally, the trial started on March 18th of 1980, and Roy pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and then 1 count of second-degree murder because he technically said he was not there when Andrea was murdered. It was said that he exhibited during all of this absolutely no remorse, no compassion towards the victim. He basically was willing to give the information, but it wasn't because he felt bad about what he did. It wasn't because he wanted the families to have closure or he needed to get it off his chest. It was just to save his own ass, essentially. And he was told during this trial that he was a sociopath, he was beyond rehabilitation, and he was sentenced 45 years in prison with parole eligibility in 2010. Now, Lawrence, on the other hand, went in on April 24th, 1980, and he had 29 different charges for kidnapping, sexual assault, sodomy, murder, criminal conspiracy, possession of a firearm. His list just went on and on and on and on and on. He also, while waiting for his trial, had attempted to persuade 2 different inmates to go and kill Robin Robeck, the woman that had been released from the sexual assault, so that she couldn't testify against him. So Lawrence is an actual psychopath monster. When he showed up, he refused to even enter his plea. He just sat in silence when he was asked, so the judge ended up entering a not guilty plea on his behalf. And then he finally fully went to trial in January of 1981, and Roy took the stand and described everything about them in the same chronological order that I have just given you. But of course, Lawrence's defense was the same as Roy's was. Lawrence's defense pointed straight at Roy, said Roy was the mastermind behind all of this, that he had actually been the one to act out all of these crimes. I also believe that the defense and Lawrence got ideas from Joseph coming forward, saying that Roy gave him all of this information about the crimes because they claimed that Lawrence hadn't been a part of them either, that Roy actually came to him and confided in him just like he did to Joseph, but there was no real way of escaping the fact that the Polaroids existed and they were in his possession and all of these things. So he had an explanation for that too. He claimed that he paid all of these women to let him take these Polaroids, that everything was consensual. Lawrence claimed that they all had consensual sex, that it was agreed upon with everyone, and then once all of that was done, Roy offered to always take these women back to wherever they needed to go, but Roy, according to Lawrence, would take them to the San Gabriel Mountains, kill them, and then throw them. And Lawrence claimed he had no idea any of this was going on. But then they ended up playing the tape that was found from Shirley's murder. And this caused a big issue within the courtroom. It was kind of a matter of, is this even appropriate? Like, should we even play this? Because it is the most terrifying and life-altering recording of a murder you could ever possibly listen to.
It was the most devastating testimony the jury has heard. The agonizing screams of teenager Lynette Ledford as she was being tortured in a moving van. The accused, Lawrence Bittaker, showed no emotion as he listened, his eyes fixed on a transcript of the tape. The jurors concentrated on the transcript as if to try and block out the screams. It was too much for one member, who wept. A spectator rushed from the courtroom. It was more than she could stand. KNBC artist Elizabeth Williams also had to leave briefly, too overwhelmed to keep sketching. The tape recording lasted 11 minutes. Then Superior Court Judge Thomas Fredericks called a recess. Some spectators had waited days to hear the tape over defense objections. Now, those spectators wish they hadn't.
I've heard screams before. I thought I'd be able to sit and listen, but I've never heard anything like that in my life.
I just couldn't believe it. I have a daughter, and I just could see her, and I couldn't take it.
And you've heard it, obviously, several times before, and it still seems to affect you, obviously, quite deeply.
I just picture those girls and how alone they were when they died. I'm sorry.
In his opening statement, the prosecutor told the jurors the tape would give them some idea of what hell is like. He was right. From the county courthouse in Torrance, Joe Ramirez, News Center 4.
This is how devastating this tape was. But while the entire courtroom was in shambles over having to listen to this, Lawrence was smiling. He was excited about these tapes. Roy ended up coming on stand and claiming that Lawrence would play them often while they were driving around, that he said they were funny. The tapes of him killing a woman and beating a woman were funny. And then Lawrence, on the other hand, claimed they weren't hearing him mock or beat or kill a woman. He said that she was in agreement to make these sounds, that they were creating a theatrical performance for the sake of the recording, and that none of that was her actually being in any harm at all. When it came to calling character witnesses at the very end of Lawrence's trial, they couldn't find anyone. This is basically a time where someone can come up and attest to your character, say that you're a good person. It's kind of the last shove towards the jurors to believe that someone's not guilty, but not a single person could be found at all to attest to Lawrence's good behavior. There was one man that said he paid his rent on time, and that's literally it. After 3 days of deliberation, Lawrence was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of rape, and many, many more charges, and he was sentenced to death.
Did you at any time ever use an ice pick?
No, sir.
You struck Miss Lamp with a sledgehammer. Do you recall the sledgehammer which was introduced?
Yes, sir, I recall it.
Was that true?
No, sir.
Lawrence attempted to appeal, but it was dismissed in June of 1989, just months before his scheduled execution date, so he figured the next best thing to do would be to just appeal the sentence. So this ended up delaying his execution date, and it was moved for July 23rd that year. He again appealed and was given a new date for, I believe, a year after, on July 9th, 1991. And not all too shockingly, as of this very minute, Lawrence is sitting on death row at San Quentin State Prison, not having received his full punishment yet. He's almost 80, you guys. Lawrence is almost 80 years old. He might even be 80. I can't remember when exactly his birthday is. And he's been on death row for 38 years. His victims didn't even make it to their 20s. So do the math. He has spent almost double the amount of time waiting for his punishment than his victims even lived. He's outlived half the jurors on his case. He's outlived the judge. He's outlived an assistant prosecutor. He's outlived the original detective on the case. Yes, you heard that right. Paul Bynum, the one to be first assigned to this case, he ended his own life in December of 1987. He was only 39 years old. 39 years old, you guys. He left a 10-page paper with his reasons as to why he ended his life, and Lawrence and Roy were one of those reasons. He was so traumatized by what they did. He was so traumatized by the tape from Shirley. He was so terrified that these men would somehow get out of prison or be released from prison that he was just haunted by what they might do to him if they got out. He was so messed up over these men that he ended his own life out of fear of them. Lawrence is just a freaking piece of work, and it doesn't even stop there. We know he attacked all these women, he killed all these women, he tortured all these women, From jail, he tried to finish off one of the victims that ended up getting away. But on top of that, he found ways to make everything miserable while in prison as well. He filed over 40 frivolous lawsuits from the time he was put in jail to 1993. If you're not aware of what that is, it's basically a lawsuit that's absurd and will never actually have anything come of it. It's just to be a pain in your butt. He filed these lawsuits over things like his cookie was broken when he got it from the cafeteria, or they smushed his sandwich in the jail cafeteria. He lived to just cause people problems, and it got so bad that he was prevented from filing any lawsuits ever again in 1993 moving forward unless he had permission from a judge or an attorney. He's a freaking monster. Like, I don't know how else to describe him. Roy himself is at Donovan State Prison, where he still claims responsibility for his actions, but still pushes majority of the responsibility over to Lawrence. He said Lawrence was the one that was driven to kill. He was simply sexually motivated. But despite all of what he claims, we know what he was a part of. We know what he chose to do. We know the actions he took in it. He was very capable, likely, of doing all of this on his own. He just has this thing about wanting to make himself feel better and at least look a little better than Lawrence. He was declined parole in 2009 and 2019. I believe he first did not attend his parole hearing, so it immediately bumped it 10 more years. I believe he attended the one in 2019, so literally just this year, but it was denied. Now he will not be eligible until 2029. Thank God is all I have to say. I personally don't think he should be eligible for parole, but my opinion. The tapes from Shirley's torture and murder are now in the hands of the FBI, and they are used by the FBI Academy to desensitize and train new agents. These young women were cheated out of justice for what they had to endure from these men. The fact that their families waited so long to figure out what was going on, for things to be sentenced, things to be done. 2 of the bodies were never even found. The fact that they were given a promise by the courts that Lawrence would have the death penalty, he would never be able to hurt anyone again, and then here he still sits alive. It sits with me all sorts of wrong ways, and I think it's heartbreaking and a prime example of how there is no justice fully for victims. It's something that will permanently exist to victims' families and victims themselves if they are still alive. It's not something that can go away, and at the very least, the person needs to be punished in the way you claim they're going to be punished, period. And it's heartbreaking that this is what families have to deal with years and years and years later, and I am sure at this point, some family members have died before they got to see Lawrence receive his full punishment, and that's just so backwards. This is all I have for today's video. There's a lot more out there that can be researched on this. I am almost positive, in my personal opinion, there are other victims that they just couldn't successfully manage to link to Lawrence and Roy. I also find it very interesting because they almost like swapped roles. I know that sounds kind of strange, but when they were younger and growing up, Roy was the very sexually aggressive predator and Lawrence was just kind of a thief. But as soon as this happened, at least from Roy's perspective, which we already know is skewed, it seems like Lawrence really kind of took on a bigger role. But again, there's no telling what happened. Everything I just told you, there could be so many missing parts because Lawrence won't say certain things. So I don't know, this whole thing makes me so uneasy, and I'm heartbroken for the families that are still having to sit back and wonder if Lawrence will ever actually be punished. I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to the story of these multiple different victims of the Toolbox Killers. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to become a part of the Howlin' fam, and I will see you guys in my next Halloween video. Bye.